Good morning, everybody. Really excited to have you all here. We will get started in about a minute. Aiza, do you see the record button?
Yes.
I'm actually going to ask you to record and just make sure that you record to iCloud.
Okay.
You see that option?
Yeah, right now it says that to either pause or stop recording, so I think we should be good.
I'm sorry, say that again?
For right now it just says to pause or stop recording, so I think we should be good. It's recording.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Okay. Well, I think we should get started. Aiza, if I can please ask you to start recording.
Yep, got it. Okay, we are now recording.
Wonderful. Welcome everybody to PICHTR's Climate Adaptation Collective webinar on water, green infrastructure, and resilience in the built environment. We are recording this session, and of course it is going to be made available to everybody that is here today, as well as everybody that registered for the event. My name is Veronica Rocha. I am going to be emceeing this event, and helping me out is Aiza Rocha, who is going to be helping us with all the technical questions that you may have. So please send those her way. And she's also going to be helping us with the Q&A later on. So really excited to have all of you here. So please go to the chat function in Zoom and introduce yourself. Where are you calling from? Wow. I love seeing all of these responses. So we see people from Hawaii and America, Samoa, Kahala, the Netherlands. That's exciting. Wow. Lots of people from SSFM, Cornell University. Amazing. Hey, Lila, Sea Grant. Wow, this is super exciting. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's always such a pleasure. Okay. Hey, Ida. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Ross. It's wonderful to see everybody here. Next, I want us to test out the Q&A function. So if you can please go to the Q&A function in Zoom, and please enter what questions are you hoping will be answered by today's discussion. All right, one more time for those who missed it. Please go to the Q&A and input what questions are you hoping will be answered by today's discussion. Somebody said LOI project, so maybe that'll be something that will be discussed today. Okay, well, keep entering your questions, everybody. We will have time towards the end for Q&A, but at any time, please feel free to enter your questions. We will try to answer as many throughout the webinar. Okay, so for today's discussion, I will provide a quick introduction, then we're going to go into two panel presentations, and that'll be followed by a group discussion. Again, at any time, please enter your questions into the Zoom Q&A function. So a little bit about PICHTR's Climate Adaptation Collective. This is PICHTR's newest initiative. The focus, of course, is on climate change adaptation. And what we are currently doing is helping with capacity building. Today's webinar is part of that effort, as well with regards to advocacy. The word collective in climate adaptation refers to the collection of related challenges, opportunities, and people committed to making a meaningful difference in climate change adaptation. So for today's discussion, so you're going to hear Barry talk about in a little bit how climate change impacts are going to create that we either have too much water or too little water. So today we're going to be talking about this concept of living with water and what it means in terms of building greater climate change adaptation and resilience capacity. We will be discussing integrated water planning and green infrastructure and how it can strengthen resilience in the built environment amid current and future climate change impacts. We are also going to be discussing the interplay of design, architecture, engineering, policy, and natural solutions in paving the way for innovative water resilience solutions. As you can see, we have a ton to talk about. So without further delay, I would like to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. First, we have Judith Stilgenbauer. She is a professor of landscape architecture and urban design at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where she serves as the founding director of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program. Judith's creative work in teaching and applied research focuses on the role of process, performance, and placemaking in ecological urbanism and public open space, that is, design across diverse spatial and temporal scales. Her recent design research has focused on urban and land-water relationships and adaptive coastal resilience design. We also have Barry Usagawa. He is the program administrator for the Water Resources Division of the Honolulu Board of Water Supply. He administers, check this out, water systems planning, water conservation, recycled water, long-range planning, hydrology, geology, and project review functions of the department. So certainly he has a huge role to play. Barry is also a member of the Hawaii Community Foundation's Freshwater Council, which developed the state freshwater blueprint for water conservation, reuse, and recharge targets to ensure 100 million gallons a day of resilient water by the year 2030. As you can tell, we have two amazing panelists today. So without further delay, I would like to turn it over to Judith to please start sharing her presentation. Thank you, Judith.
Sorry, got to unmute myself. Thank you, Veronica and PICHTR, for the kind invitation. Let me minimize this. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Make this full screen. So today I want to spend the next 15 minutes, I'm going to set a timer, this is the reminder to myself, on highlighting the importance of incorporating nature-based urban design strategies in the long-term planning for resilient waterfronts in this case, applied to Honolulu's primary urban center. So specifically what I would like to do today is visualize what those coastal adaptation strategies, such as living shorelines that are aimed to decrease climate-related vulnerabilities, might look like in urban Oahu. And when I give these kinds of presentations, my goal typically really is to advocate for the anticipation of climate crisis-related urban challenges, such as multi-hazard flooding and nearshore developments, and also, visioning potential solutions now, so we can think, plan, and regulate well ahead of time, rather than thinking of these types of projects as post-disaster recovery planning. So with that, I want to jump right into talking a little bit about green infrastructure and looking over the attendee list. Many of you are familiar with this concept, so I'll keep it brief. But at the most basic level, you could think of vegetated elements in a city, in the built environment, as green infrastructure. And those types of systems, in many cases, harness natural processes by providing ecosystem services for communities and sites. For example, green infrastructure can protect neighborhoods from flooding, manage and filter stormwater. It can help us prevent erosion. It can contribute to combating the urban heat island effect. Through phytoremediation processes, has the ability to remove pollutants from soil, water, and air. Green infrastructure also sequesters carbon, and there are many other ecological and social benefits. Linking ecosystems, providing habitats, and thus increasing biodiversity and overall resilience. And so, as a landscape architect, I like to think that green infrastructure can supplement, or in some cases even replace, outdated, gray, engineered urban infrastructure in smart and also cost-efficient ways. So my remaining 12.5 minutes I will spend on illustrating some of these concepts through my team's South Shore Promenade and Coastal Open Space Network project that we have been working on with the State of Hawaii Office of Planning for 2 years. And I will use some of the visuals and design drawings from that project to illustrate how large-scale green infrastructure systems can help us address coastal climate-related vulnerabilities. And so what you will find is that in this type of work, we, rather than focusing on flood control and or sea level rise adaptation alone, we really intend to view urban open space design more comprehensively and balance aspects of climate resilience, ecological performance, connectivity, and also the cultural aspects of placemaking. And by doing so, demonstrating that those goals are in fact really perfectly compatible and mutually beneficial in many cases. So let's dive right in. I don't think I need to explain to this audience the severe impacts we are expecting in the primary urban center of Honolulu over the next 50 to 100 years related to sea level rise and increased instances of coastal flooding. For this project, we did 100 analytical maps that I'm not going to show you today because we only have 10 to 15 minutes. But you can see here, of course, Waikiki Kaka'ako over toward Mapunapuna, the airport, and also areas here in Aiea will be really very soon heavily affected by increased instances of flooding and amphibious varying ground conditions. And then, when we studied these coastal areas, we found that many of the sites, not all of them, of course, but many that are most vulnerable early on are publicly owned. So either by the feds or the state or the city and county, which, when you think about implementing early demonstration projects might be something that helps us in this instance. Now, when we study the outcomes of many related planning and design initiatives across the country, we find that there are several, I want to say by now, commonly agreed upon strategies that we apply as planners and designers to dealing with sea level rise and coastal flooding adaptation. So I like to use this slide to summarize this. Is of course a lot more complex in reality, but many of us still think that hardened engineered solutions such as seawalls, levees, and so forth are the way to go. Personally, I think we've learned a lot from incidents around the Gulf of Mexico that hardened infrastructure often fails and is not flexible or adaptive and also expensive. So more commonly in my field, in particular in the 21st century, we think of living shorelines and nature-based green infrastructure solutions as an alternative almost to those more hardened engineered solutions. And you will see a lot of visuals in a little bit related to that topic. It's really the focus of my presentation today. On the other hand, there are many parts of our urban core where we have to also adapt over the next 80, 100 years. by elevating critical infrastructure, by elevating buildings in their building systems on fill or pilings that allow water to flow underneath, or by conceiving of new developments as floodable so they can withstand at least occasional instances of water coming in and water withdrawing. And then in the most severe scenarios, I think we also need to acknowledge that there has to be thinking in the long term over retreat from the shoreline, or we have to withdraw in a managed and planned way areas that are subject to very frequent inundation. And that retreat, of course, then would open up opportunities to introduce more living shoreline systems that protect the neighborhoods that lie beneath. So the following four maps, including this one, are from our South Shore project, and there you can think of them as a summary of how we in the long term, so let's say by 2100, would envision that these principles might apply along the south shore of the primary urban center of Honolulu. So you can see the blue indicates areas that will have to adapt. The yellow that's underlying some of these dots, we think in those areas, we need to seriously think about retreating from the shoreline and then converting those areas into living shorelines. So you can see here the project segment from Diamond Head to Kaka'ako, then moving over from Kaka'ako toward the airport, here with Mapunapuna being a major hotspot. And then the airport area is really interesting to my knowledge, and maybe one of the attendees can correct me. I don't think the Department of Transportation has real plans for how to adapt over time. So that's of course very speculative what you see here, but we like to point out that something has to happen there. And then over from the airport toward, Pearl Harbor, situation looks a little bit better. Now this map is, you could think of this as almost a summary that shows this proposed long-term network of living shorelines comprised of existing and proposed open spaces along the shore of the urban center, and they would be connected by a continuous multi-use coastal promenade that connects those open spaces. So there could be a win-win, where by conceiving some of our shorelines, we also have an opportunity to get rid of automobiles and really provide more connectivity to and along the shore. Now, another project goal was to really visualize what these green infrastructure interventions might look like if applied to a set of potential demonstration projects. And to do so, my team and I identified 3 catalytic sites through a process of elimination, where we basically looked at 6-foot sea level rise, the area that's affected. Then we overlaid large landowners, both public and private, because we argue if there's one large landowner or a few initial interventions might be easier logistically than if you have 100 private landowners. Then we overlaid that with a 3-foot sea level rise map to identify the zones that will be affected earliest. And by doing so, we came up with a whole large group of opportunity areas, which we narrowed down to 3 what we call catalytic sites, where we think of these as projects that if there's political will, or some of these thoughts could be tested out in a real world scenario here on Oahu. And I have 4.5 more minutes left, which I will spend on showing you what that would look like. And I saw one of the first questions in the Q&A asked about the Army Corps project. So of course, parts of the Alawai Golf Course and also Waikiki will be affected very early on and are already affected by king tides. And in the next 20 years, we will see increasing instances of flooding. So what we are proposing here in this speculative project is that 9 holes of the existing golf course will be fairly soon converted into a large scale green infrastructure element of wetland. There would be a continuous promenade elevated off the ground along the Mauka edge of the Alawai. 9 holes in Topgolf could exist for the next 50 years. And then in the long run, that part could also be replaced by, say, a flood type urban agriculture system, wetland, such as taro fields, that could support a new, denser, maybe mixed-use development around the edges of the site that will remain dry. So to visualize this a little bit more, you can see here a typical cross-section across the Alawai with Alawai Boulevard in the north, the golf course on the south side, and the golf course on the north, where in the near term, in the next, say, 30 years, you know, the water would be allowed in, part of the golf course would be converted into a wetland. There's the Mauka arm of the new South Shore Promenade. Over time, this would develop into a really biodiverse wetland. So when you look at this in cross-section, the northern edge of the Alawai would be softened, water would be allowed in, people could interact with this new park and ecosystem, and in the long term, it would, you know, become this new floodable, performative, large-scale living shoreline element. Whereas on the south side of the canal, you know, the urban edge of Waikiki, we envision that this purely sort of, or mostly automobile-centered Alawai Boulevard over time would be turned into a kind of a super dike, wide landscaped promenade with only public transit that would make a waterfront amenity and at the same time protect Waikiki from being flooded on this side at least. 2 more minutes. So these are some of the visuals of what those interventions might look like, so the audience can begin to understand, you know, how they could interact with these sites and how easy it really would be to do something like this. So this is the newly envisioned Alawai Boulevard on the left, promenade on the right, wetland behind it, people on the promenade where you can see how there could be educational opportunities, placemaking opportunities, new gathering spaces shaded that are prioritized for pedestrians and bikes, access to the wetland in a safe way that does not disturb the wildlife and habitat functions. Few more views of what these pathways might look like where they run on large landscaped berms that help with flood protection, and then a summary of how the golf course over time would be turned into this more performative large-scale piece of infrastructure. Only 1 minute left, so I'm gonna not go into catalytic site 2, but show you a few visuals of catalytic site 3, which extends from Pearl Harbor Visitor Center to basically the Aiea Bay recreation area. And you can see that especially in this location of the current national monument, the most visited site on Oahu, we will see, and we currently already see flood impacts very early on. So, and currently this site is heavily dominated by impervious surface parking structures. And you can see how in our concept, some of this would be converted into wetlands, how these new waterfront promenades would hover over the wetlands, how we're thinking about connecting over to this new denser TUD development and the new Halava train station. Everything that's currently not publicly accessible here would be made publicly accessible, and the visitor center that's currently very hardened and prone to flooding would begin to perform, would be designed so it can be floodable. We would retreat from the shoreline. Parking would be accommodated in structures, so and there would be a little shuttle connecting over to the train station. And over time, you know, it could be an example of what these types of living shorelines and retreat might actually look like. And these are some of my last visuals, because it's important to us that people can begin to understand what a win-win and improvement these types of projects could really be. Thank you.
Judith, this was excellent. Thank you for helping us, reimagine what a more resilient ecosystem would look like when we truly live with water. I love it. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Barry Usagawa to talk to us about the One Water planning framework. Barry, if you can please share your screen.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you to PICHTR for inviting me to talk about our One Water framework for climate resiliency. I'd like to first thank Kristen Reynolds of One World, One Water, who actually put the slideshows together. And so I'm going to give her presentation and then add my perspectives to that. But this framework was presented to the City Climate Change Commission late last year, and as of June 10th of this year, they supported it unanimously and made a recommendation to the city administration to pursue the proposed actions that I'll go through. So let me see, why do we need One Water? So I think as you opened, you said most climate impacts involve water, too much or too little of it. And we're talking about too much being flooding, especially with climate change, too little of it with drought. So we have forecasts that show more intense weather and climate change, creating this kind of flooding. And of course, the opposite would be more drought. But I'd like to, this is just a Venn diagram of some of the plans that are in play, focusing on water infrastructure. So I'm talking fresh water for drinking, wastewater, recycled water, and stormwater and green infrastructure. And these are plans that are in various stages of development, and some we don't have them yet, but I'm talking about the city and county of Honolulu. Some facts that you may not know: there is a UH rainfall forecast to 2100 in statistical downscaling that is showing 65% or so reduction in rainfall to 2100. Now there's a wet scenario, but we've converted that into recharge, and it resulted in a potential reduction in our aquifer sustainable yields by about 38%. So over a third could be lost if we have this long-term drying trend. And that has significant impacts for like Honolulu, which is pumping close to the sustainable yields of the aquifer. And imagine if we had to cut 1/3 of that pumping down, how would we make up for that loss of supply? We'd have to get much more efficient in conservation. In terms of like wastewater, certainly spills and infiltration inflow are their main issues. Just for the Sand Island wastewater treatment plant, that averages 65 million gallons per day of wastewater treatment. In a storm, they've said that their wet weather flow can increase up to 4 times. So that's a lot of infiltration and inflow into the collection system. And then in terms of the drainage systems in urban Honolulu, I've heard where some of the drain systems, of course, are built, close to a century ago. They're designed for, some areas are designed for only a 15-year storm, and they're supposed to be designed for a 100-year storm. And as rainfall starts, as you get more flooding, the 100-year storm of yesterday is not going to be the same as the 100-year storm of tomorrow. It's going to get more intense. And so, these are the current, and then of course the roadways along the coastal areas that are subjected to sea level rise, they're low in elevation, and of course all our utilities are in those roadways. So given these, I can't forget contamination, because certainly if the water quality is affected, it will not be usable either. Emergency preparedness is very important, but then now you overlay the climate change impacts of sea level rise, coastal erosion along our coastal highways and low-lying bridges where we have infrastructure along those roadways. Heat is affected by water too, and humidity. The heat index will make everything feel hotter. And so, as Judith was talking about, some land use decisions have to be made. We have to determine where, what streets need to be and properties need to be elevated, where we need to retreat. I can tell Judith is not a golfer though, because converting all the way into a wetland, I guess, is one option. Anyway, maybe I'll go someplace else. Anyway, but then there's social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts. And so the only way to really solve this, no one agency can. And so our One Water collaboration framework is to work together in a formalized fashion so that we can start to address some of these issues together. And I think together we can go farther. So what is One Water? There are many definitions. This is from the Water Research Foundation. One Water is an integrated planning and implementation approach to managing finite water resources for
Barry, for some reason, we can't hear you. Barry? Thank you. I think your voice is back. We couldn't hear you. Can we do a quick test?
Oh yeah. Are you not hearing me?
Now we can hear you. Your voice went away, but now you're back. So.
Okay, so where did you lose me? At the beginning.
Right, no. Right when you started talking about this slide, what is One Water?
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, just a few seconds ago.
So you folks can read the definition, but it's a rebranded term of integrated resource planning, which may be familiar to many of you. It is a national program, and it is being driven in many large municipalities for different reasons. Primarily, it's for drought and limited drinking water supply. But here, the driver is really about climate resilience of not just the water resources, but of the infrastructure related to water and the roadways that contain our infrastructure, okay? So how would we apply it? Well, there are some plans ongoing. We looked at the city organizational structure and look for these overlaps, these integration points where, if you think of the Venn diagram, the overlap between wastewater and water is recycled water. And by the way, we have the largest recycled water system in the state. However, there are much more opportunities to expand recycled water on Oahu, and we're not there yet. But that's an example of an integration point. Also, if you're putting in detention basins in the urban space, of course, we're focusing on the forest area, but if you're going to capture it through cisterns, then reuse it and use it to recharge the aquifer and use it for non-potable irrigation. So that's sort of the overlap where we're trying to, an example of these integration points where so it's not all the CIP, it's just those projects that have these overlaps. And then we're trying to establish a scope of work, a set of priorities and demonstration projects. So let me get into the actions. So the first thing is to establish an ordinance. And the reason for an ordinance is to institutionalize the collaboration, because right now it happens on an ad hoc basis, on a project by project basis. Having an ordinance basically enables the action to adapt to climate change, focusing on infrastructure. And we can develop ways to implement the mayor's directive for climate change and sea level rise. So there's a draft ordinance that we're kicking around right now, and hopefully we can get that submitted to City Council. Action 2 is developing MOUs, and so the ordinance is an enabling law, but the MOUs provide the more detailed level standard operating procedures. It's an agreement to work together to advance climate resilience. We identify our common objectives and priorities amongst the various city departments. So it's not just the storm and wastewater and freshwater guys. It's Department of Design and Construction, it's Department of Transportation Services, the Department of Planning and Permitting, perhaps the Department of Parks and Recreation. All of our departments have some play and some responsibility towards adapting to climate change. So identifying them, bringing them together, and identifying some demonstration projects, and then some cooperative funding if funding is available. So action 3 is to establish a One Water panel. And this is really to consult on these city projects and programs, to collectively review private development and master plans so that we can put in these resilience features into private development. I think of all the high rises in Kakako, there's only one that has a large cistern stormwater capture system. We missed a big opportunity there. But we could do that by updating building codes and design standards. And in the panel, we want it to be authorized at the department head level, but the participants would be like my level, like division heads, or the guys in focus responsible for the long range plan, integrated resource plan, and the long range capital improvement program. And we want to tie that to budgets. So once we put the actions together, we tie it to an annual budget that is reported annually to the city administration and the city council. And that's the idea of how we get the thing, keep the momentum going. Action 4 is establishing a one water component in the broader planning framework. And already in our development plans and sustainable community plans that you may be familiar with, we are folding in climate change and sea level rise policies that will drive land use actions, and also our watershed plans, watershed management plans, which is the integrated water resource plan for the county. And those strategies and projects will drive functional planning for infrastructure, for condition assessment, for capacity, and then into the implementing ordinances and regulations, and to get things done, so that everyone's kind of rowing in the same direction. Okay, action 5 is coordinating on a CIP and annual budget for a one water resilience checklist. So I was telling you, said before, tying it to budget is important, because every year, there should be a question, hey, have you, what's your progress on working on this checklist? And this checklist is sort of like a to-do list. There is a research and monitoring component. Of course, Judith already, showed the UH and Chip Fletcher's sea level rise modeling, Shelley Abel's modeling. We're working on a groundwater monitoring well network as well. Policies and regulations, the mayor's directive, but also, and working on the land use policies now. We really need to tie sea level rise and flood insurance rate maps together. They're separate right now. What are the inundation areas? What kind of regulations around shoreline setbacks, around the special management area, incorporating the sea level rise exposure areas. Of course, financing is an issue, FEMA for repetitive loss areas, improvement districts, tax incentives, and then the feasibility studies for infrastructure planning. Various infrastructures have completed their vulnerability assessments like we did for water. Others are in various stages, but assessing and creating a list of priority criteria. Where do we focus our efforts on the sea level rise exposure areas? What kind of adaptive strategies? And Judith went into some of that. DFM is working on a drainage or stormwater master plan right now. How can we update our on-site reuse rules to capture more stormwater on-site and reuse and recharge and retain or detain that stormwater, because we know the storm drains don't have the capacity. Of course, then public outreach, and then ultimately get into design and construction. Where do we lift? Where do we retreat? The only way we can figure that out is working together, because time is running short. We have not only my presentation, but by mid-century, the streets will become traffic hazards, because that's when nuisance flooding is anticipated to start to be visible. Talked about the private development area, but as a team, developers would try to incorporate these green infrastructure and these resilience strategies into their developments, because they're going to last 50, 60 years. So, and then ending with demonstration projects to work through the details of collaboration. Mupuna, certainly the University Complete Streets, which is ongoing, expanding EVA water reuse into buildings, flushing with recycled water, for instance, the otherwise stormwater management plan, cesspool conversions, and even in the non-urban, the rural spaces, we're working on a Loy restoration project in Waihe and in the back of Manoa. So some quick wins, some early things we can work on as a team once the ordinance is adopted, and then we can start to get to work and get things done. So I would lastly end with that, we have a big opportunity in Hawaii. We're in a unique position. We have full political control over our watersheds, and we are a headwater state according to Kristen. We have jurisdiction over the mountains, watersheds, all the way to the ocean, to the reefs. It's a very unique situation compared to other states, so we have an opportunity to be a leader in one water in the nation. It's a way to implement actions and define how we can meet the climate change directive. So One Water can help us adapt to climate change, improve infrastructure resilience, and protect our resources. And I'll end with that, and hopefully you could hear it all, and then I'll be available for questions. So back to you, Veronica.
Thank you, Barry. That was excellent. Really appreciated hearing from you about the One Water planning framework. So we have a ton of questions. Audience, please continue inputting your questions. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask Aisa to pull a few questions from the audience so we can discuss further. My first question is for Judith. Judith, my question is, during your presentation, you described several strategies for things like living shorelines, floodable development, floating development for sea level rise, and coastal flooding that are perhaps less common throughout the state of Hawaii. What will it take to implement more of these innovative strategies as opposed to perhaps the more traditional hard engineered infrastructure systems that are more typical here in Hawaii?
Veronica, that's an excellent question. One of the first things that has to happen, I believe, is that we all just begin to slowly but surely shift mindsets. And that's one of the reasons why I like to take these kinds of visuals on the road, because I think there's something that has to happen about public opinion in all of that. But on the other hand, it goes much deeper than that. There's a lot of economic questions, there's a lot of questions of ownership and so forth. So, I'm not an economist, I'm not a planner. We are landscape architects and designers. So our role is really to come up with design solutions. What I like to stress though, and maybe I can just share my screen really briefly. One thing I want people to keep in mind, oh, sorry, that's you again, large. Oops, sorry about that. Here. What I presented, these long-term scenarios, they look at a 6-foot sea level rise scenario. So let's just say roughly 2100 if we go with an aggressive estimate. And when you look at, say, these historic shorelines in the primary urban center of Honolulu, sorry, it's a large file. You can see how heavily over the last, mainly really 80 years, we have manipulated the shoreline. So everything that's rendered in this more grayish blue is area of fill. And when you overlay that with the current inundation maps and projections, a lot of that trouble area is actually in fill areas, particularly where these streams meet the ocean. It makes a lot of sense, right? Because that's where we used to have fish ponds or other floodable development. So I think what I would like to stress, and I want to turn this into another lecture, is that we need to really not take the current shoreline condition for granted and acknowledge how much this area has changed over the last decades. And if we project 80 years into the future, we need to start planning now so we can begin to regulate and put the frameworks in place. So when buildings or infrastructure elements reach the end of their lifespan, they have to be either adapted or moved higher up in the watershed. So I like to point out this timeline because I think it puts things in perspective.
There we go, I was on mute. Thank you, Judith. That was very helpful. Okay, the next question is for Barry. Barry, you described, let me go back to sharing my screen. Barry, you described this excellent One Water planning framework, and you talked about collaboration. So my question for you is this planning framework something that the private sector should care about? And if so, why? And how are you, as a public entity, planning to work with the private sector?
Thank you, Veronica. That was one of the action items, is to work with private developers and landowners around how they can fold in more resilient features into their redevelopments. I think it's important that if they're building in a Lerexa area, that they understand that they have to elevate their properties. Um, we don't know how high and where it's going to drain, and that's what their questions they're asking. They also asking questions around, well, if you're going to create on-site reuse rules, what are they? Um, how? I think they support it, but they're concerned about delays in permitting, especially if it's something new. So the idea is to have the One Water panel that have similar long-range viewpoints and have influence on the permitting and regulatory side of the city to help private developers build a project that is climate resilient. The only way is to meet and talk about it. Right now, they go one agency at a time, which is okay, but collectively, I think we can see a bigger, broader picture. We'll be able to see those integration points and offer suggestions that the developer could consider, and taking advantage of the examples that are occurring right now in other mainland municipalities that are folding in this type of water integration.
Thank you, Barry. That was very helpful. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I hear that the audience really wants to, be able to see the panelists and engage with you a bit closer. Okay. Thank you again, Judith and Barry. I'd like to start tackling some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. So Aiza, if you can unmute yourself and please walk us through 3 questions from the audience.
Of course. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. This first question is for Judith. And we would like to know if you could talk more about if Honolulu's economy was to move away from tourism to build resiliency, and if Waikiki was expected to be underwater by the year 2100, how feasible would it be for the city and state to buy buildings in Waikiki for the purposes of retreat? And would you propose starting off as affordable housing and then later on removing them to convert to living shores?
Yeah, I saw that question in the Q&A. I think it's Lauren's. Hi, Lauren. If I'm not mistaken. I will freely admit I'm not an economist, and the economy aspects of this problem are huge and complicated, and especially in an economy such as ours, where we don't value carbon sequestration and ecosystem services really at all. We don't have mechanisms in place yet to do that. So it's very hard because I feel we're comparing apples with oranges. But it's a long question. So I'm not so sure about affordable housing because, there is a tendency nationwide that when we see these coastal vulnerabilities, those who can afford to relocate do, and often underprivileged, underrepresented groups stay behind. So I have a bit of an issue with proposing, homeless encampments or affordable housing or public housing in those flood-prone areas. I'm not sure that's the right approach personally. But yeah, there would have to be a model where the state probably buys back property as buildings reach the end of their lifespan in the most vulnerable areas, or perhaps in 30 years people will feel incentivized to get rid of that property anyway, because we see instances already where insurance companies don't cover flood-prone properties. That means that owners can't get mortgages any longer. So perhaps down the road, the market will help regulate some of that. It's really not my area of expertise. It's a question I get all the time, and that's about all I can say about it. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you for answering the question as best as you can. The next question is actually directed for Barry from Mr. Ford. And they were wondering if you could expand a bit on your proposed demonstration project in the Waihi area, and if you could identify any boundaries of the initiative, and does it involve cesspool conversions?
Thank you for that. So Waihi Loy Restoration and Riparian Learning Center, we just filed a draft environmental assessment with the Office of Environmental Quality Control. It should be posted, I guess, August 8th, I think. It'll explain the project, the restoration project in detail. But it's something that we've been working with the key project in the Waihi community for about 2 decades now. There are a lot of ancient terraces around the stream, and they're interested in restoring it. It's all overgrown, but the idea there is to and it's a collaboration between Parks and Recreation and us, because we are both the 2 landowners. There is trespassing and hiking, trespassing as an issue there. It is a large water source for Winter Oahu. And so there are a lot of overlaying conflicts or impacts to the resource. But the idea is to restore the loy, create a farm, have it be a center for cultural education and watershed protection. It could be a launching point for invasive species control and workday projects in the Mauka watershed. Ho'ounerd side, those valleys are all invaded with non-native and invasive species. Albizia is prevalent. And so putting that all together and having some community presence there could actually help with some of the trespassing issues that we're seeing continuously, where we have to have hire special duty police officers to keep people out. So it's a method or a way to actually get some restoration done with an educational component and address the hiking. Now, in terms of cesspools, yeah, there's a lot of cesspools from, I guess, Apuimano Road going north to windward. And that, in fact, Kahalu estuary is very contaminated with a lot of bacteriological contamination, mostly from cesspools too. So the conversion of that to septic tanks is one of the demonstration projects we're thinking of in the One Water, because it involves the Department of Health, the wastewater department, but there's no wastewater system in the Waihe area, but there is in other areas. So protection of groundwater and their sure waters is important. So the conversion of cesspools is something that's ongoing. The Department of Health wastewater branch is on it, but that certainly, because we're taking this holistic watershed view towards restoration and management and protection, that all of those factors would fold in. So, but check out our draft VA at the end of the week.
And then our final question will be addressed to the both of you. And this is from Leah Bremer. And she would like to know about what the opportunities are to integrate biocultural approaches into living shorelines and general green infrastructure.
I typed an answer to some of those types of questions. One, I accidentally messed up. Sorry, it's the first time I'm using this Q&A feature, but I just wanted to point out, and maybe some of this was answered in my presentation, that all 3 proof of concept designs for the catalytic sites incorporate aspects of Native Hawaiian biocultural sort of traditional land water systems, because Native Hawaiians, of course, were incredible ecological engineers, and we can, you know, if we apply those principles in a 21st century way, they can become important components of green infrastructure systems and layered coastal living shoreline systems. So like in the Alawai component, we have a urban agriculture, a lo'i, large scale lo'i component. For the Ke'ihi Lagoon side, on the Kalihi side, we have a series in the proposal that I didn't show today of fish ponds that become part of the layered coastal defense system. So wetlands would filter stormwater before it enters the fish ponds, and then the fish ponds are at that interface between the lagoon and the wetland. And then also inside 3, you've probably seen that triangular shape is you know, meant to be a fish pond. So there's a lot of opportunities. This project that I presented today is a 500-page report. So I really just showed you a glimpse. And if anyone is interested in learning more, you can always contact me directly. My email address is public on the UH website. So I love to have these discussions.
So I know the Department of Facility Maintenance is very progressive in trying to create a stormwater utility and provide some incentives around more green infrastructure, primarily in the urban space, to reduce the amount of impervious surfaces. So to the extent that green infrastructure could be expanded, you know, it may take off a few percentage points off the drainage capacity needs in a storm. But there are a lot of benefits there. I am an engineer. I dabble in planning. I cannot see Waikiki being turned into a living shoreline. However, because of all the investment there, but there are spots, opportunities, such as perhaps Mopuna Puna. You know, when you get into these areas that have repetitive loss, and we already see Mopuna Puna flooding at high tide, especially in king tide. And at some point, you know, you can lift the road 3 feet, but then when you start getting to like 4, 5, 6 feet of sea level rise, you're really, you know, losing the battle there. Chip Fletcher always, you know, often talks about living with water, and you know, if you fight a war with water, you will lose eventually. So, you know, I can see for Mupuna perhaps elevating Ahua, Kilihau, and Kokoi streets, you know, 3 feet just to, you know, but that'll last maybe, I don't know, 3, 4 decades. It's a cost benefit relationship or evaluation to me. These areas are going to be repetitive loss areas. So as, you know, when you get sea level rise and you get a storm, you can get all this damage. So if you keep having to repair them, at some point, you know, it's probably cheaper to retreat. And if you decide to retreat, you know, there's compensation to the landowners, but you know, at some point, when you do retreat, that's the opportunity then to create these living shorelines and provide some restoration. So having a long-term plan, kind of laying it out, is probably beneficial there, because otherwise we're spending, wasting public funds, hardening an area that is so low in elevation that's going to continue to be, you know, damaged. So at some point, bite the bullet and make the decision. But that's a hard choice. But that's why I think the collaborative, you know, would have to tackle those types of hard questions, come up with a process, provide some prioritization criteria. Where do we focus our efforts? Because we have limited funding too. But have that long-range plan and the possibilities. So I really appreciate the work that Judith has done, and I hope to see your 500-page report one day and maybe incorporate some of that into our integrated resource plan. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Judith. I wish we could keep going because there's so many great questions, but I did want to point out a comment that I think is very important from Harrison Rue from TOD, Transit-Oriented Development from the City and County of Honolulu. He wrote, just as a heads up to all here, we are publishing the draft EIS for the city's Kapalama Canal catalytic project, which is in the area Judith showed, and will serve as another pilot for incorporating SR and GI And he also said, also publishing shortly our new climate adaptation guidelines for urban development, which address many of these issues. If not on the TOD mailing list, look at www.honolulu.gov in the next couple of weeks. I think one of the things that I heard today was the need to really collaborate and coordinate among so many different plans that are being developed by so many different entities. So I feel like that is a huge challenge. I am encouraged by the One Water initiative that Barry presented on today. I'm also encouraged by the many innovative designs and thinking that Judith brought to the table today. And I'm really excited and hopeful that as we move forward with climate change adaptation, all of these things will come to fruition. So I need to unfortunately wrap up. And I want to again thank Judith and Barry for sharing their experience with us today. Also, I'd like to thank Aisa for helping us with the Q&A and technical matters. Wrapping up for today's event on water, green infrastructure, and resilience in the built environment. Thank you so much. Please feel free to get in touch with us. You can find us at adaptation@PICHTR.org or 808-943-9581 if you want to call us. Of course, I'm also adding our website here. If you can enter into your chat your #1 takeaway from today, we'd very much appreciate it. Now, in terms of what's next, we will be providing this video recording as well as slides from today's presenters and a feedback survey to everybody who registered for this event. This will be coming to you in the next few days. So please, keep an eye out for that. We will also be emailing you next time that we have another webinar on the topic of climate adaptation. So with that, mahalo, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to our next webinar with you. Aisa, if you can stop the recording now, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.